Alrighty. Hi, everybody. My name is Jay Rosa, and I'm an organizer for Jolt in Dallas Fort Worth. Jolt Action is a nonprofit Latino youth led organization building power and respect for our communities through education and issue advocacy. So, today we're going to go over the fundamentals of voting rights, how Latinos in Texas and across the nation set the groundwork for what voting looks like today, and how we can help Tejanos now. So let's start from the very beginning to understand the circumstances Tejanos faced. Through land ownership changes and wars that led to migration to Texas, Tejanos are the roots of Texas. So we're going to jump into Texas's independence and the US annexation. So on the left, you can see the Mexico-US map before Texas declared independence. And then on the right, you can see how the map changed when Texas declared independence in 1836 and became the Republic of Texas. You might ask, why would they become an independent state? Well, Texas was breaking the law. Mexico had allowed American settlers to move in, but they had to follow Mexican rules like banning slavery. Texans refused, which led to the Battle of the Alamo that we often learn about in our state history classes. And 9 years later, after Texas became an independent state, the US annexed, aka adopted, Texas in 1845. This is because of US expansionism at the time. The US wanted more land, and that meant expanding into California, New Mexico, and oh my god, and the disputed land in Texas and Mexico. So as you can see on the right, there was disputed land that both Mexico and Texas claimed. Mexico said that Texas ended at the Nueces River, which is more north, and Texas claimed the border was Rio Grande, which is more south. So this dispute between the land led to the Mexican American War. So after the US adopted Texas, the US sent their troops to the Rio Grande, the land that both states claimed, which led to the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 ended the Mexican American War. So this treaty promised US citizenship to Mexicans in ceded lands, meaning they were protected under the US Constitution and their laws. So at the time, the Tejanos who became newly naturalized citizens mainly spoke Spanish. But Spanish speaking Tejanos would still face exclusion because these rights were often ignored, as we will see with voter suppression tactics later in my presentation. So, why is this treaty even important? Well, this is the first legal foundation or building block for Tejano civil rights in the United States. 28 years later, after the Mexican American War, Porfirio Diaz started his term as president of Mexico, creating a dictatorship. Diaz ruled Mexico for 30 years, favoring the wealthy. This angered indigenous and impoverished communities, which led to the overthrowing of his presidency and ignited a civil war from 1914 through 1917. The Mexican Revolution and the Civil War in Mexico led to the doubling of Texas's Latino population, because Mexican citizens sought protection from war, which led to the generations of future Tejano Americans. All Latinos in Texas, those who became naturalized through the Treaty of Hidalgo and those who migrated because of the Civil War, both faced labor exploitation and language discrimination. So efforts to silence and disenfranchise the Janos communities grew as our population grew. And before we move on, today's the last day of Women's History Month. So I want to quickly highlight the Adelita Soldaderas, which are the women warriors supporting the Mexican Revolution against the dictatorship. So between 1910 and 1920, Adelitas not only fought with men, they served as spies, nurses, and provided essential support to revolutionaries. Their legacy helped break down traditional gender roles, inspiring women to demand for equality. If you would like to read more about them later, I will link the article in the presentation that we will share in the follow-up email. Okay, so centering back to Texas, both Tejanos who became naturalized citizens because of the ceded land and Mexicans who sought refuge in Texas because of wars in their country faced labor exploitation. So, what is labor exploitation? Well, labor exploitation means unfair treatment of workers, particularly when they are paid little for their work, forced to work in unsafe conditions, or be subjected to abusive practices. Tejanos and Mexican migrants in Texas experience wage theft, low pay, and extremely dangerous working conditions. The main jobs held by Texas Latinos at the time were ranching, railroads, mining, and farm labor. So, this was a lot of information. I'm going to give you a moment to digest our overview of how Tejanos shaped Texas and the circumstances they face. So, take a moment just to do a quick little summary of how Tejanos shaped Texas. Okay. So now that we have a better understanding of what jobs Mexican Americans had and the main language spoken by them as a result of these historical events, we can go back into our next topic. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the history of Latino voting rights. We will be going over US amendments, poll taxes, interpretation tests, white man's primaries, court cases, and voter intimidation. So before we do that, remember how we talked about the Treaty of Hidalgo in 1848 that ended the Mexican-American War and Porfirio's dictatorship of 1876? In between these dates, the US was enacting different laws, and two of these laws were the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment prohibited denying voting rights based on race, color, or previous condition of enslavement. And then the 19th Amendment, because of the women's suffrage movement in the US, Congress passed this on June 4th, 1919, which prohibited denying voting rights based on sex. So, although these constitutional rights affirmed US citizens' voting rights, women of color and people of color face further suppression through poll taxes, literacy tests, language accessibility, and so much more. So, those amendments led to poll taxes. All Texas voters were required to pay a poll tax, which was a requirement put in place by the legislature in 1902 to keep minority groups from voting. It was also a barrier for women who had very little access to their own money. Remember that Texas could not explicitly have laws that denied the vote of Black Americans and American women because of the 15th and 19th Amendment. So what they did is they had to create creative ways to discourage people of color from voting. So the poll tax in Texas was usually $1.15. And using the inflation calculator, that would be about $35 in 2025. Could you imagine going out to vote or registering to vote and having to pay a $35 fee? That's pretty insane. So this placed a huge financial burden that disenfranchised women, Latinos, and Black Texans. So now we're gonna go over what literacy tests are. So what are they? They are exams designed to assess a person's ability to read and write. It's important to note that Texas did not implement literacy tests. Why? Well, their reason being is that they risk disenfranchising poor white voters in rural areas. At the time, in rural white Texans were illiterate or semi-literate because of lack of education, and kids worked instead of attending schools. And the people in power knew that those votes were needed in order for Texas politicians to retain the power in the state. So, although Texas never passed literacy test laws like other states, local officials use something called interpretation tests and English only barriers to deny Latino applicants. Because remember, Tejano's primary language is Spanish. So, what some county registrar would require voters to read or explain part of the Texas Constitution in English, even though this was not mandated by the state. So while white Texans were given easier passages, and or sometimes no passages at all, Latinos were mostly picked to take these interpretation tests. So we are going to do a little hypothetical activity to understand the feeling of not being able to read a legal passage in a language that you have little knowledge of. So let's imagine that instead of English, the US and Texas adopted French as one of their main languages. This is the 1930s, and you are a Latino man. Because remember, women at the time didn't have control over their finances, so they couldn't even afford a poll tax. So you finally saved enough money to pay the poll tax, but now all of a sudden, a county registrar asks you to read and explain an excerpt from the Texas Constitution in order to vote. The only thing is, it's in French. So I want you to take a second to take this hypothetical situation in before we move on to reading the excerpt. Okay, so yeah, make sure to read the passage and then the instructions are at the bottom. Once you read the passage, put an emoji in the chat or write down in the chat how this makes you feel. Would you be able to translate that or interpret that language? Okay, I see Christina said, boo, I'd have no idea what this says or how to pronounce anything. Exactly. Okay. See the melting emoji? Real. Let me see. This makes me feel lost and annoyed that I couldn't vote because of this. Yeah, it makes me feel like I'm inept, but I feel like that's exactly what they want. Yes, exactly, Silali. They want us to feel like we don't deserve to be in these spaces. We don't deserve our right to vote, even though at the time they were US citizens. I see Victoria. I would have no way of reading this. The Hispanic in me is trying to read it with the Spanish accents. Uh, um, Giovanni says, frustrated that there is nothing you can do about it as well. That's so true. Okay, so now that we took a moment to look over what interpretation tests are, we're gonna do a little just quick overview of what we're gonna go over next. So we already went over US amendments, what poll taxes were, and interpretation tests. So now we'll be going over what white man's primaries are. So, what are a white man's primaries? Well, this was a very unique voter suppression tactic minorities faced in Texas. In Texas, in the early 1900s, local Democratic chapters at the time, when the party was different, added internal rules within their party to ban Black and Latino voters. This later became a state law when it passed the Texas legislature in 1923, legally banning Black voters from Democratic primaries. While the Texas state law adopted in 1923 only or explicitly targeted Black voters, it still made it very easy to exclude Mexican Americans from these primaries. So counties in Texas like Dimmitt, Zapata, and Duval barred Latinos from Democratic primaries. Why? Well, Latino farmers were moving to South Texas, and people in power saw their potential political power as a threat. So they used white man's primaries as an excuse to exclude Latino
University of
voters.
Texas withdraw scholarships.
Oh, no worries, Beverly. Alrighty. So a few years after the white primaries became state law, Dr. Nixon, a Black physician from El Paso, Texas, sued after being turned away from voting. This case is known as Nixon versus Herndon in 1927. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled that this was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guaranteed equal protection under the law, and Nixon versus Herndon helped challenge future racial discrimination cases in voting and other civil rights. So, after the court ruling of Dr. Nixon versus Herndon, the Texas legislature responded by declaring the Democratic Party as a private group not run by the state. So, the Texas Democratic primaries were able to discriminate and exclude minorities because they are a private organization. So, remember, this was the Democratic Party at the time. Um, this is not like the current one. So the Democratic Party at the time was conservative, and later decades, the political party switched. And this is a whole other topic that's very interesting. But this is just a very brief explanation of how political parties played a huge role in this disenfranchising Latino voters. So, because Texas refused to allow minorities to vote in primary elections, even after the Supreme Court ruling, Dr. Lonnie E. Smith in Houston. So, Dr. Lonnie E. Smith in Houston, Texas, decided to take the matter in his own hands by suing Harris County Judge Allwright, who denied him the right to vote in the 1940 Democratic primary. So 4 years later, in 1944, the Supreme Court finally ended legal white primaries in the South because it violated the 14th and the 15th Amendment. So private parties like the Democratic Party are still mandated to follow constitutional law because they are running state elections. So this led to a huge shift in voter suppression tactics because now it was more difficult to disenfranchise people of color's voting power. So voter suppression is more now focused on gerrymandering and language barriers. So 10 years later, after the Smith versus Allwright case, Pete Hernandez, a Mexican American agriculture worker, was convicted of murder in Jackson County, Texas. His lawyers argued that the exclusion of Mexican Americans from juries violated his rights and the 14th Amendment. So, again, as a reminder, the 14th Amendment has a rule called the Equal Protection Clause, explaining that no state can deny equal protection. Juries should be fair, and a jury should represent the community. And at the time, this applied to Black and white people, but it did not include Latinos. Mexican Americans were legally classified as white, but they were treated as a distinct class and faced discrimination, including exclusion from juries and segregated schools and segregated public facilities. So the courts ruled that Mexican Americans were a protected class under the 14th Amendment, which banned jury exclusion. So you might be asking, Jay, what the heck does this have to do with voting rights? Well, this case really laid the groundwork in acknowledging for the first time that Latinos are protected under the 14th Amendment. The decision set a huge precedent for using the 14th Amendment to eliminate discriminatory practices, and it helped later reform bills like the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and its 1975 amendment, which specifically addressed language barriers for Latino voters. And I'll go over these two voting rights acts a little further in my presentation. But for now, we will be going into what voter intimidation looked like. So, oh, actually, give me one second. I need to sip some water. So, one of the other ways voter intimidation and suppression was rampant in Texas could be seen through the San Benito incident and the Crystal City revolts. So, in 1963, in San Benito, Texas, Mexican American Antonio Mendoza was beaten by police and jailed without medical care for 17 hours. And this was ruled a suicide, but it sparked Latino political advocacy. And months earlier, Mexican Americans in Crystal City successfully organized to elect their own candidate, which they called Los Cinco. This is what inspired activists in San Benito because of the injustice Latinos are facing regarding police brutality. So, Mexican Americans began gaining political powers in places like Crystal City and San Benito. And as a response, white people in power responded by bringing in Texas Rangers to intimidate voters and accuse activists of being anti government, despite them only wanting fair representation. Does this sound familiar to y'all? Yeah. Okay. Alrighty, so we'll move on to the Voting Rights Act. So 2 years after the 1963 event in San Benito, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted. This banned discrimination, but it did not touch on language barriers. It banned literacy tests and poll taxes, but ignored the language accessibility issue, which disenfranchised Latino voters. Because remember, most Latinos, most Tejanos, mostly only spoke Spanish. So, because of this language barrier, the Voting Rights Act was amended in 1975. So this amendment included protections for language minorities, and it mandated bilingual ballots, it mandated bilingual election instructions, and bilingual voter registration forms. And Spanish became a named category for citizens in federal law. So this meant that Latinos were finally able to fully have the rights and accessibility to vote. However, unfortunately, these protections are currently at risk due to the current presidential administration. So now that we went over those two very important acts, we're going to talk about what happened after, which is gerrymandering. After all these laws that were enacted to protect marginalized communities and help them gain access, people in power realized that they had to find sneakier ways to disenfranchise voters. So, what is gerrymandering? Well, the goal is to either help one party win more seats and to reduce minority voting power. So how do they do this? Well, what they do is they redraw voting district lines to favor one group, like a political party or a race. So gerrymandering can be described in two categories: cracking and packing. You might have heard this a lot in your history classes, but it's very important to remember because we're still facing this today. So cracking is, for example, is splitting Latino and Black voters across multiple districts to dilute the power of marginalized communities. The other example is packing. This is where the lines are redrawn so Black and Latino voters can be in one single district so that other districts are controlled by white voters. This can overpower a singular district, making it harder for voters to have their voices heard. So I'm going to show you a gerrymandering example. After the census in 2020, oh, I think the image is loading. Give us 1 second.
I think our image went missing. So 1 second. We are gonna upload. Oh, there it is. Why isn't it showing up? Okay. Weird, spooky. Okay, we are going to zoom in on here and then we'll restart the presentation.
Okay, so after the census in 2020, the Texas legislature underwent redistricting the following year. So this process redrew where districts fell, which ultimately determined who voters could elect based on the district. So, for example, on the left, you can see Irving, Texas, which is a suburb of Dallas. This image shows what this district looked like previously. Although the shape looks wild, the demographic graph shows that it was more equal in ethnicity. And this district in 2020 mostly voted for Democrats. And then when districts were redrawn, as you can see on the right, the demographics changed to a mostly white district. And 61% of this new district voted mostly for Republicans. So what does this mean? Well, this drastically changed the landscape of this area. This meant that the voters in Irving that were still Democratic voters had less of a voice because they were being drowned out by these new Republican voters at the ballot box. And if you want to find out more about it, you can visit the 2021 Texas Tribune article on congressional district changes. And gives a really good visual guide as to what gerrymandering looks like. Okay, so all of these cases that we talked about shaped what voting rights look like today. So let's remember Nixon versus Herndon from 1927. Let's remember Smith versus Albright of 1944, Hernandez versus Texas of 1954, and the 1975 voting rights, which finally allowed language accessibility to Tejanos. Um, it's it's also important to honor the Black activists who really laid down the groundwork for Latino activists to fight for our communities. And this work continues today. This is what intersectionality is. It is understanding how struggles for justice are interconnected and how solidarity across movements strengthen our fight for equality. During all these cases, let's remember that these voter suppression tactics, laws, were also being passed. People in power use different voter suppression tactics to discourage marginalized groups from voting. So yeah, before we move on to the next step, I just want to mention if you learned one new thing about the history of Tejanos today, or if this served as a good refresher, then I encourage you, once you get this presentation, to read a couple articles and sources that we will provide in the follow-up email. Now, let's talk about the current situation in Texas. I will be passing it on to our lovely advocacy and policy manager, Christina.
All righty. Okay, friends. Now we're going to talk about why voting access matters. And kind of looking through all of our history, we see that our right to vote has been severely limited. We've seen various barriers to suppress our vote. And I just want to point out that if our vote didn't matter so much, why would the people in power keep trying to take it away over literally decades? Our right to vote is a fundamental part of the way that we express our voices, our needs, and our representation in our government. Voting is power, and especially for the Latino community, we have an opportunity to cultivate that power by going to the polls for every single election. That includes city council, mayor, school board. A lot of these races are up in May. And of course, for our representatives at the Capitol in Austin that are currently writing and filing a bunch of bills and laws, as well as the Capitol in Washington, D.C. We can make our voices heard over and over again through our vote. So, where are we now and what do we do? We're going to talk about what's currently happening in our legislature that is affecting our voting rights. And again, I want to point out that we talked about this history because we can learn a lot about what's happened in the past, and it can tell us why some of these things continue to happen, why our vote continues to be suppressed, and what we can continue to do about it. So, one of the bills I'm going to talk about is in our Texas Senate. It's Senate Bill 76, and this aims to eliminate the county-wide polling place program. A lot of you guys might have heard about this already, but essentially, the county-wide polling place program lets voters cast ballots at any polling location in their county. This isn't across the state like universal, but there are several major counties that participate in this program. But with this bill would force voters to go back to precinct-based voting, where you'd have to vote at a very specific location on election day during this time. And again, that, makes it harder for us to vote. So I want to just take a quick poll check here. Who here has benefited from county-wide voting in the past, where you could go to like any location in your county? Put a thumbs up if you've benefited from that in the past. I recently moved from Denton County that didn't have countywide voting to Dallas County, which does have countywide voting, and that has been a huge difference in being able to just pick which place I'm going to go vote in. Seeing lots of thumbs up. That's good. That's good. So yeah, now imagine that that's taken away from you. Now you have to go figure out, like I mentioned, exactly which location you have to go to for what day, what time. Let's imagine that the lines are super long. Maybe you only have like an hour lunch during your workday, and the polling location that you have to go to is like a 30-minute drive. That's going to make you a lot less likely and able to vote. It's a voter suppression tactic, just like the ones we saw in our history, and it hurts our ability to make our voices heard at the ballot box. So we strongly, at Jolt Action, oppose this bill that's currently going through the Texas legislature. We also have another Senate Bill 16, that is also going to hurt our vote. Senate Bill 16 aims to suppress our vote by forcing Texans to show proof of citizenship in order to register to vote, or if you're already registered, it forces you to prove your citizenship to be able to go vote. So this documented proof of citizenship would be a passport or a birth certificate. A regular ID doesn't count. It has to be like one of these proof of citizenship documents. And the reality is that many Texans lack immediate access to these documents. Like, first of all, millions of people don't have a passport. Also, are you just walking around with your passport and your birth certificate all the time? No. So this leads to a huge disenfranchisement, especially for seniors, for students, for naturalized citizens. This is a huge burden on us as voters or as folks who want to get registered to vote by requiring this proof of citizenship. And of course, as you guys know, we're a civic engagement organization. We register voters in our communities year round. Imagine if we had to start asking for this type of documentation in order for people to get registered. Like I said, they're not walking around with their birth certificates. So it's just going to make everything extremely hard. And again, it's just a voter suppression tactic to make it harder for people who already have the right to vote, get registered, or go vote. Similarly, the SAVE Act, this is a federal bill. So the two we talked about were under the Texas legislature. The SAVE Act is a federal bill that aims to do the same thing as Senate Bill 16. It does that proof of citizenship thing. This means that all 50 states would have to require proof of citizenship when people register to vote or vote. It's noteworthy that non-citizen voting is already illegal. Like, you can't vote without being a citizen. And people there is no proof that there are a ton of people who aren't citizens that are voting. So again, this is just a bill used to stop supposed voter fraud, but in actuality, it's just blocking eligible voters. And it very specifically hurts people of color, married women, like if they've changed their maiden names, to their legal name, their new legal spouse's name, like their birth certificate isn't going to match. Again, this hurts seniors, this hurts naturalized citizens. It just makes voting harder for all of us. And it, again, really is just a tactic to make this whole thing harder and harder for people to go out and get registered or to go vote. And it's the same type of tactics that they used in the past, sneaky tactics to try and get around our right to vote, like our fundamental right to vote. So these are terrible things that are happening. What's something we can do about it right this second? I want to take a moment and remember the Latino activists that paved the way for our voting rights. Now is a time for us to be able to set the next building blocks for future Tejanos, just like our ancestors set it up for us now. We want to make sure that these harmful bills are stopped. So as Texans, we have a very powerful opportunity when it comes to the Texas legislature and letting our representatives in Austin know how we feel about these things. So I'd like everybody to go ahead and scan this QR code. We're also going to put the link in the chat. Thank you, Marta, for putting the link in the chat. And this is going to take you to a form. So I'm going to switch over to that screen so I can show you guys what that looks like. So you're going to see this form. Can you guys give me a thumbs up if you're able to see it? I'm seeing a couple thumbs up. Okay, great. Awesome. So this is our petition to stop Senate Bill 16 and to protect Latino voting rights in Texas. Again, this is a dangerous piece of legislation that Texas is trying to pass that mirrors the stuff that the federal government is trying to pass. And again, it would force Texans to show proof of citizenship in order to register or to vote. And it's just a bill that won't stop fraud. It's looking for a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. And it's just going to block a bunch of eligible voters from registering to vote. So what we're asking for you guys to do now is to go ahead and put in your information. And what this is going to do is we'll be able to send an email specifically to your senator in order to tell them that we oppose Senate Bill 16. This is a very powerful thing that we can do because the more opposition that our senators see about this bill, the more likely they are going to vote against it and make sure that our voices are heard because, again, they're our representatives. They need to make sure that, they're representing us. So go ahead and put in your information. As you guys can see, mine's kind of pre-filled out here. And I'm going to put in my address as well, because what this is going to do, once you go down and click to send message, this is going to show you who your state senator is based on the address that you provided. And then once you see this second step, you're going to see the email subject that we want to send, which is Stop Senate Bill 16, Protect Latino Voices in Texas. And then we've gone ahead and written out an email for you. It's going to show, it's going to tell your senator that we want them to oppose Senate Bill 16 because it's a bill that would create unnecessary barriers to voting and would risk disenfranchising thousands of eligible Texans. Like I mentioned, it's a solution in search of a problem that doesn't exist. Voter fraud is not widespread and does not happen enough for this bill to make any type of sense. It targets the wrong people. Non-citizen voting is already illegal in Texas. Like, you already can't be a citizen to vote. So why are we putting these extra barriers in? So again, we want to make sure that we're stopping Senate Bill 16. Oh, I'm trying to scroll down here. Like we mentioned, it creates unnecessarily delays. Many Texans, including those from low-income backgrounds, rural communities, and marginalized groups, don't have easy access to our passports or birth certificates. Super expensive to get a passport. It's a pain in the butt. So we want to make sure that this isn't a requirement for us to get registered or to vote. So again, it hurts Latinos who are eligible to register to vote and vote. So we want to urge you to protect voting rights and reject this harmful bill. Our democracy works best when every eligible Texan can participate. So I've already sent this message. So once you've done that, you can just click send message, and then you will get a confirmation. So I'm going to give people a couple of seconds to do this. Does anybody have any questions? Okay. For prefix, Edgar, I think that isn't a required box, so I don't think you have to put anything there. Martha, can we share with family and friends? Yes, absolutely. I see some dones. Thank you, Tori. Loving it. I'm going to give it like 15 more seconds. Fernando, can we edit the script message to make it more personal? Absolutely. If there's a specific story that you have or something that you want to say about you or your family's experience, yes, please, 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 you can edit it and I can show you guys. Yes, you can edit it and make that more personal. Edgar won't let me go forward. Okay, if you want to just put like an MR in the prefix, we'll fix that later, Edgar. Sorry about that. Sitlali, how often does Joel go to the state and national capital to lobby for this cause? How can I get involved with that? Ooh, great question. So we do not go to Washington, D.C. often, but we do use apps. If you guys have heard of Five Calls, I think that's what it's called. It's an app that like allows you to be able to look up your congressional, your like federal representatives, and we do calls to action there. And then for the Capitol in Austin, we last what 3 weeks ago, Martha, 2 weeks ago. Now I'm losing time. We went along with Planned Parenthood to specifically talk to our representatives about Senate Bill 16. We dropped off a couple of one-pagers. We are also planning on going to the Capitol later in April. And it's not super often just because of like capacity and like driving down there. But we do a lot of calls to action that we can do from home. And we'll be sending out some more information about future calls to action on specific bills where you can call your representatives, email your representatives, and send public comments. So we'll be able to share that with everybody after this. Oh, thank you, Fernando. Fernando also put that 5 calls for the our federal representatives. All right. I am going to go back to our presentation. And I appreciate everybody for taking the time to do that call to action. It is going to be super important for us as advocates to be able to like go together with a strong message and say to our senators like, no, boo on this bill. So that is everything for today. We want to thank you guys so much for joining us to talk about voting rights. Huge, huge shout out to Jay and all the research she did on the history of our voting rights. It is very common that we do not learn a lot of this history in class. I know for me, when I was in school, all I learned about was the Alamo and that the Mexicans were the bad guys. That's all I learned. So it's really, really great for us to have the opportunity to learn about this stuff and to be able to see what our ancestors and the people before us, the advocates before us did in order for us to have the voting rights we have now. And now it's our turn to make sure that we continue to empower ourselves and empower our community and make sure that we're upholding voting rights for future generations. So I want to thank you guys so much for coming today. So what we're going to do next is I'd love for you guys to tell us how we did today. We're going to put the link to a survey in the chat. It's just a Google form. Please let us know how we did. We appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to put on webinars like this. I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds to scan the QR code, and then Jay dropped the link in the chat. So yeah, we want to be able to constantly improve on the webinars we put on. And so speaking of, we will have other webinars throughout the rest of the year. Our Levántate y Lucha series is year long, and it's going to go through the rest of the year. And our next one is going to be in May. We are going to be putting out some other educational materials on our website and sending it to you guys through our email for like other topics, but our like live webinar, the next one's in May, and that's going to be specifically on climate justice and the economy. We know as Latinos that the climate change heavily affects us, and that we see a lot of the negative effects and consequences of climate change, like air pollution and just natural disasters, extreme heat. So we're going to talk about like how climate change affects like the way that we're able to thrive as a community in Texas. So please sign up for that. We're going to go ahead and drop the link to our website where the webinar is there too. I'm gonna go ahead and copy paste that into the chat. And you guys can go there and sign up for all of our future webinars. The next one's in May. Then we have one on education in June. We're going to have a day of advocacy in July. And then we're going to have a few Latino history webinars in September for Hispanic Heritage Month. So we're super excited about those.